On the 25th of July in the year 1894, the British steamer Kowshing was on its way to Korea. It would find itself caught up in the Battle of Pungdo. The Chinese warships Jiyuan and Guangyi were assigned to protect troop transports in Korea, while on their way back to China, encountered a guerrilla fleet of 3 Japanese vessels in the Sea of Pungdo. There was an exchange of fire, and the Guangyi was severely damaged while the Jiyuan raised a white flag and left the area with the Japanese warship in pursuit. At that moment, the British transport ship Kowshing unknowingly entered the area of battle. It was carrying 1,100 Chinese soldiers. The ship was ordered to halt by the Japanese ship Naniwa, which was pursuing the Jiyuan.
就是发现高升跟操江的时候，浪速舰在追济远舰，然后是吉野跟那个邱金洲在围攻广乙舰。这时候浪速发了一个旗号，说：“哎呀，前面出现2艘商船了，该怎么处理？”
日军采取一个什么措施呢？日军就把浪速号留下来，盯着看着高升号，来对付高升号。吉野号呢就去追这个谁呢？就继续去追这个济远号。邱金洲号呢就去追这个超江号。
As the Japanese flagship Yoshino closed in on the Jiyuan, which was flying a white flag, it was fired upon and damaged. Captain Feng Boqian of the Jiyuan reported that the damaged Japanese ship flew a white flag and the Chinese naval ensign in a sign of submission.
从丰岛海战回来之后，写了一个战斗报告，他都篡改成什么样子呢？说是我们在追日本的吉野舰，追到吉野舰挂白旗，挂我国龙旗而跑。
This event is controversial. Xue Er, an overseas Chinese scholar, wrote that Japan believed the Jiyuan had surrendered, and the story that torpedoes were fired even after it had surrendered was fake. That excuse was used to sink the Kowshing. The Japanese warship couldn't overtake the Jiyuan, so it turned back to deal with the Kowshing. And at that time, Japan regarded the Kowshing as its biggest spoils of war from the battle.
高升号这条船呢，它的排水量是1000来吨的一条船，所以想象中上百中国清军一上去以后，根本就没地方待，肯定大量的人都在甲板上面，所以日本人老远一看就能知道你怎么一回事。你虽然飘扬的那个英国旗，但是一看上面全是中国军队。
The Naniwa began to negotiate with the Kowshing. The captain of the Japanese warship was Heihachiro Togo. Heihachiro Togo joined the Japanese Navy at the age of 19. When Feng Boqian, later the captain of the Jiyuan, joined the first Chinese naval students in Britain, Japan was also sending its first naval students to Britain, and Togo was among them. Not as fortunate as Feng Boqian, Togo couldn't attend Britannia Royal Naval College, and instead he went to the Merchant Marine Academy. He stayed in Great Britain for 8 years. Starting from the lowest rank of sailor on a merchant ship, he was ordered to supervise the manufacture of a Japanese warship there. And after his 8-year stay in Great Britain, he piloted the warship home as a maritime expert.
东乡平八郎他本人非常关注国际法，在高升号事件当中所展露出来的这个胆略来看，他对国际法不仅是一般的了解，他甚至可以说是非常非常的精通，他就打准了国际法的一个最薄弱的一个环节。
Togo wasn't sure what to do with the Kowshing. The Naniwa was several hundred meters from the Kowshing and had its guns aimed at it, but nothing happened for quite a while. Konstantin von Hanneken, a German passenger on the Kowshing, later concluded that the delay was the result of the ship being under the British flag. Thomas Galsworthy, captain of the Kowshing, recalled that after the smoke of the Battle of Pungdo cleared, the Naniwa sent a small boat to the Kowshing under the command of Japanese Lieutenant Hitomi.
那么浪速呢，在这种情况下呢，它这个碰到高升的时候，它呢也是带有明显的敌意，而且说是本身这个神经绷得也比较紧，就登船跟英国当时的船长进行交涉。
The Japanese stated that they wanted to take the ship and those aboard to Japan. They used the excuse that the Kowshing was carrying Chinese troops.
英国船长跟他辩论说：“他说我们离开这个大沽港的时候，你们没有发生战争行为，而且你们到现在都没宣战，我们不处于交战行为。那么按照原来的惯例，那我们应该退回到出发港。”
但是呢，日方当时就很强硬的说我要俘获你，假如说你不跟我这个一块走的话，那么我就要对你击沉你。
The captain of the defenseless Kowshing feared his ship would be sunk by the powerful Japanese. It was best to do what the Japanese told him to do.
英国船长就说：“那我服从，我跟着你去，就愿意同意当做俘虏。”
Captain Galsworthy made a statement used in a lawsuit regarding the Kowshing that the merchant ship was in no position to resist a warship. But his decision to comply with the Japanese was fiercely opposed by the Chinese troops, who were led by two colonels.
高升号的这个船上的最高指挥官叫高善济，理论上对他有个印象，就这个人说的都很有道理，但是呢，总有点夸夸其谈的那个味道。
Because the colonels did not speak English, the German passenger aboard the Kowshing was called on to interpret. Hanneken suddenly found himself involved in a standoff in the role of mediator. Hanneken was a private passenger, but in the eyes of Captain Galsworthy and First Mate Templin, he was not an ordinary one. Galsworthy recalled that when Hanneken came aboard the Kowshing, the first thing he asked was, "Are you waiting for me?" The captain replied that he didn't know Hanneken was coming, to which the German replied saying he was allowed to go to Korea on the Kowshing. Later, Hanneken would arouse the keen interest of all parties to the international lawsuit regarding the Kowshing sinking. Japan's official report on the incident stated that his position as the only private passenger was highly suspicious. The Japanese noted that he had an unusual relationship with the Chinese government, so he couldn't be regarded as an ordinary passenger.
"他在德国曾经是军人，退役以后没事做，就跑到中国来了。他就在天津的海关找到工作，
做过李鸿章的副官，并且顾问。
Hanneken became Li Hongjiang's confidant and made important contributions to China's military procurement and training.
后来就是这个大列湾旅顺口建这个近代海军的时候，他这个修这个要塞炮，修的工程还不错，李鸿章还比较满意。
Aboard the Kowshing, Hanneken was actually the private military observer of Li Hongjiang.
他不是绝对不是什么北洋舰队的一个现役军人，他不是，他是这个杨克清，就上了这个高升号。
As Hanneken boarded the vessel, he couldn't know it would be the ship's last trip. Captain Galsworthy explained that they would go with the Japanese warships to Nagasaki The Chinese officers and men were terrified, and they refused to go.
整个甲板上就是像是那个开了锅一样的，所有的人都很愤怒。
The two Chinese colonels said they wouldn't go to Nagasaki. The Japanese delegation realized the negotiations were going nowhere, so they departed. Captain Galsworthy explained to the Chinese soldiers that resistance would get them nowhere because just one shell would sink the ship. The officers responded saying they would rather die than obey the Japanese. They had more than 1,100 men, and there were only 400 Japanese soldiers aboard the Naniwa. The Chinese wanted to attack the Japanese warship. First Mate Tamplin recalled that the Chinese soldiers began grabbing their weapons and distributing ammunition. The two Chinese commanders, meanwhile, wanted to know how to flag messages. That if they wanted to fight the Japanese, they should let the British crew leave. This irritated the Chinese officers and men. One commander gave the signal to cut the throats of the British, and some of the troops were ordered to guard the captain and first mate.
船长已经几次表示要弃船，中国士兵呢是不让他弃船。
高山记这个人，他是受到中国那种传统士可杀不可辱的那种中国传统文人的那种骨气，但他同时也暴露一个什么呢？就是说他对军事的这个基本常识，特别是海战的基本的常识，他不了解。
German advisor Hanneken recalled that after he explained the situation, the Chinese officers and soldiers were in an uproar. The Chinese threatened the captain and crew with swords and guns. The captain didn't dare to flee, and Hanneken suggested that a message be sent to the Japanese asking for their delegation to return. However, when the Japanese boat returned, the Chinese were afraid the European crew would jump ship. They kept the British captain and first mate under control and stopped the Japanese from coming too close. Later, Captain Galsworthy reported that when he tried to leave the bridge to talk to the Japanese, a Chinese officer pointed a gun at him, while another held a sword. Then the Japanese warned Galsworthy that if he didn't leave with them, he would be responsible for the consequences.
日本方面呢再次登船，就更严厉地说假如你们不投降的话，我们就将你方击沉。这个时候，英国船长呢就向日方就明确讲说，我们已经丧失了这个人身自由。
After the Japanese boat left, the Naniwa sent the Kowshing a signal that those on board must leave the ship. This was a signal threatening that an attack was imminent. Hanneken stated that the signal was meant only for the Europeans and the crew, but they could not comply. The lifeboats were in the hands of the Chinese soldiers.
万一英国船长跑了，开船的人跑了，那这条船不就完蛋了吗？就是日本人拖了就走了，然后就是有一些中国士兵呢，就看住了那个救生艇，就不让人接近这些救生艇。
Captain Galsworthy signaled the Japanese warship that they were under guard and couldn't desert. He wanted the Japanese to come over again, but he was refused. Captain Togo's patience had worn out. The Naniwa approached to 150 meters, flying a red warning flag.
攻击就是个战斗信号，这样告诉你我要开火了。
狼叔号的舰长下令对高升号进行攻击。
Anakin later recalled that the Japanese warship moved closer and stopped at a distance of about 150 meters. He reported that the Japanese ship fired a torpedo, but it missed its target. The route of the torpedo was marked by a line of bubbles, but the torpedo didn't explode. Survivors of the Kowshing later said that after they fell into the water, they swam past a floating torpedo.
可能是因为那个浪速离高升太近了，那个鱼雷从高升船底下过去了，没打中。
The Japanese said the torpedo was a warning. Xue A wrote that the Naniwa loaded a torpedo in a tube to serve as a warning. However, in point of fact, the torpedo was released to empty the tube. Almost at the same time as the torpedo was fired, all 6 of the starboard guns on the Naniwa were fired. These powerful, rapid-firing guns had heavily damaged the Chinese armored ship, the Jiyuan. Now, they were firing on an unarmed merchant ship. Captain Togo wrote in his diary that he thought the Chinese troops were intentionally hostile. Captain Galsworthy and First Mate Templin were confined to the bridge. Many excited and confused Chinese soldiers were crowded on the deck. The first round hit the cold storage room in the center of the ship, and this caused utter mayhem on board. When Captain Galsworthy realized the soldiers guarding him had fled, he immediately left the bridge, grabbed a life ring and jumped into the sea.
高升号被击中倾斜，都出现沉没。这个过程中间呢，英国船长、英国船员都跳水逃生。
锅炉舱被击中，蒸汽都蹦出来，开始爆炸了。就整个这条船就是迅速的就下沉。
Among the Chinese members of the crew of the Kowshing was Dunhuang, a cook. Dunhuang emerged from the engine room to wash and eat. He remembered that after he left the engine room, it wasn't long before he heard guns and the ship began to sink. Dung desperately climbed a mast, and he found that there were already 30 to 40 soldiers on that mast, and the other mast was also full of people. According to records, the Japanese ship fired 2 rounds of shots at the Kowshing. In his diary, Captain Togo of the Naniwa wrote that after 2 rounds of shots from the starboard guns, the Kowshing stern began to tilt, and it was submerged in 30 minutes. An official Japanese document says a shell hit the ship's engine room. The Kowshing, which was carrying 1,100 Chinese soldiers, quickly sank. When the Kowshing disappeared beneath the waves, it took with it the troops, weapons, ammunition, and 600 tons of silver ingots. But that was not the end of the tragedy. According to survivors, while some people drowned, many others were killed in the water by gunfire. Hit by gunfire from aboard a ship. The scene was, of course, chaotic, and so different people gave different accounts of which ship the gunfire came from. The surviving Chinese troops blamed the shots on the Japanese. However, Captain Galsworthy of the Kowshing and others have stated that the shots were fired by the Chinese troops aboard the Kowshing. As the Kowshing sank, the troops in the water were targeted by gunfire.
一种说法，日本军舰向海里面的中国士兵开枪扫射；还有一种证词呢，我看见了高升号上的中国士兵们开枪。
The testimony of surviving Chinese soldiers would contradict that of European crew members. Join us for part 4 of The Sinking of the Kowshing.